Welcome to part 3 of the chapter 14 lecture over the brain. I have two more major parts of the brain that I'll be talking about, the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So the cerebellum is also known as the little brain. So this is a common nickname. It is part of the hindbrain, so we have various ways that we can divide up the brain, forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, for example. This is considered part of the hindbrain. It has left and right cerebellar hemispheres, which are connected by this bridge-like structure known as the vermis. It does have a cortex, which is a functional outer layer. We see that in the cerebrum as well. So when you see that word cortex, you should associate that with not only being the outer layer, but having functionality in there. So it is a functional outer layer. It's not just a protective covering. For example, there are neurons that serve important functions. So the superficial cortex consists of gray matter. Gray matter, remember, are going to be where a lot of your somas or cell bodies of neurons are concentrated. And in the cerebellum, we do see a fairly complex pattern of folds, just like we see with the cerebrum, but the folds are quite different in nature. They are thin, leaf-like structures known as folia. The cerebellum does have branching white matter that is apparent if you perform a sagittal cut. So, for example, if you do a sagittal cut down the cerebellum, open that up, you're going to see this very extensive branching network that's known as the arbor vitae. That literally means tree of life. That is white matter, so recall the difference between gray and white matter. Your gray matter, or you're gonna see the neurosomas within the gray matter, and then you're going to see the myelinated axons of the neurons in the white matter. And the white matter is white because of that myelination, because it's mostly a lipid and it has that white color. And you're also going to see deep nuclei. The gray matter and the white matter are, of course, visible just from a cursory inspection of the cerebellum, whereas the deep nuclei, you're not necessarily going to be able to differentiate boundaries of those various nuclei. But remember that nuclei, in the case of the brain, are just concentrations of neurons that have specialized functions. So the cerebellum is a fairly small part of the brain. It's only about 10% of the brain volume, but it contains more than half of all brain neurons, so about 100 billion individual neurons. Most of these neurons are known as granule cells. That's the most common type of neuron in the brain as a whole. And then you're also going to see these large kind of globular Purkinje cells that have axons that synapse on the deep nuclei. Purkinje cell is a specialized type of neuron that has very extensive branching dendrites, basically all in one plane. So it's almost like if you were to compress a tree, that's kind of what a Purkinje cell looks like. It has this very extensive branching network of dendrites on a single plane. The cerebellum has many different functions. It's long been known to be important for motor coordination and locomotion, but recent studies have revealed many different functions: sensory, linguistic, emotional, and other non-motor functions. So for example, comparing textures of objects, perceiving space as tested by pegboard puzzles, basically a spatial awareness, recognizing objects from different views, judging elapsed time and maintaining tapping rhythm. All of these various functions have been found to be seated within the cerebellum. And it's also important to note that planning, scheduling, and emotional control have strong ties to the cerebellum. and it's been found that many hyperactive children have relatively small cerebellums. So various views of the cerebellum here. We have mid-sagittal view of the brain within the cranium, a regular mid-sagittal view outside of the cranium. We have a frontal view here, inferior view. All right, so moving on to the forebrain. The forebrain consists of two parts. We have the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. All of these are going to enclose the third ventricle, which is again a chamber within the brain that holds ependymal cells that produce the cerebrospinal fluid. The diencephalon is the most rostral part of the brainstem. Remember that rostral basically means towards the front or towards the nose. And then the telencephalon develops chiefly into the cerebrum, which will be the last part of the brain that I cover. Cerebrum, of course, is this whole structure in orange here, with the exception of part of the midbrain lying deep to this cerebral matter. Okay, so the thalamus is an ovoid mass on either side of the brain. So there's one thalamus in either cerebral hemisphere. Two thalami would be the plural form here. And it is perched at the superior end of the brainstem, but technically beneath the cerebral hemispheres. So the thalamus, or thalami, constitute about 4/5 of the diencephalon. They are joined together by a narrow intermediate mass, and they're comprised of at least 23 nuclei within 5 major functional groups, which are shown here in this figure. So this is a view of your thalami. So we have one in the left hemisphere and one in the right hemisphere, and the location here is basically right below this structure known as the corpus callosum. And then the thalamic nuclei basically show where you have concentrations of neurons that specialize in various functions. So the anterior group, for example, is part of the limbic system, functions in memory and emotion. And we have the medial group, ventral group, lateral group, and posterior group, and those are going to all be associated with unique functions. The thalamus is often considered to be the gateway to the cerebral cortex because nearly all of the input to the cerebrum has to pass by way of synapses in the thalamic nuclei, and a lot of information is essentially filtered out here. So a lot of information doesn't come to our conscious attention. It doesn't need to go into the cerebral cortex. So most of the information that passes through here is essentially filtered out, but the information that does get to the cerebral cortex, by and large, passes through the thalamus. The thalamus plays a key role in motor control by relaying signals from the cerebellum to the cerebrum, and it essentially functions in providing feedback loops between the cerebral cortex and the basal nuclei. It's involved in the memory and emotional functions of the limbic system. The limbic system is a complex of structures that include some cerebral cortex of the temporal and frontal lobes and some of the anterior thalamic nuclei. So various views of the thalamus. When we do our brain dissections, you will be able to find the thalamus based on the relative locations of the pons and the corpus callosum. So the pons is right here. This is part of the brainstem. The corpus callosum is this large structure of white matter that connects the hemispheres, and basically right below that is the thalamus. It is not very distinct in terms of its anatomic boundaries. Basically, it's just going to be this area of the brain that is superior to the pons and inferior to the corpus callosum. If we look at a coronal view here, Again, we see the corpus callosum, basically right below the lateral ventricles here, and above the third ventricle, we'll see the thalamus. And then if we look at a superior transverse section here, we see that there is basically two separate thalami, one in either hemisphere. And then this shows the relative position of the thalamus with the hypothalamus. Remember that hypo just means lower or below. So the hypothalamus is going to be below the thalamus surrounding the third ventricle. So again, the hypothalamus forms part of the walls and floor of the third ventricle. You really get a good sense of it if you have a coronal view, the relative positions of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus extends anteriorly to the optic chiasm, which is where the optic nerve from either eye crosses over at the rostral part of the brain. And posteriorly, it extends to structures known as the mammillary bodies. Mammillary nuclei are what relay signals from the limbic system to the thalamus. And then we see a structure called the infundibulum, which is a stalk attaching the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. And just to test your recall, remember way back when we were studying the skeletal system and we were learning about bony landmarks of the cranium, there is a structure within the cranium that held the pituitary gland. Can you think of what that structure is called? That is the sella turcica, or Turkish saddle. So that's a landmark of the sphenoid bone. So what does the hypothalamus do? The hypothalamus is a major control center of the autonomic nervous system as well as the endocrine system. The autonomic nervous system is going to be the upcoming chapter that we'll cover. This is the nervous system that controls our body systems that we don't have conscious control over. So fight or flight, which is the sympathetic nervous system, and rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. And then the endocrine system, which has to do with glands and hormones. So the hypothalamus plays an essential role in maintaining homeostasis, which is that internal balance of conditions that is necessary for the maintenance of life. Functions of the hypothalamic nuclei, we have hormone secretion, controls the anterior pituitary. The pituitary can basically be thought of as kind of two separate structures that are connected to one another, but histologically they have different origins, so we break it up into the anterior and posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamic nuclei controls the anterior pituitary, which ultimately regulates growth, metabolism, reproduction, and stress responses, and then they directly produce the posterior pituitary hormones involved in labor contractions, lactation, and water conservation. And then we see autonomic effects. It's a major integrating center for the autonomic nervous system, and it influences heart rate, blood pressure, gastrointestinal secretions, and motility. Motility is basically the rate of movement of food matter and digested food through the GI tract. Gastrointestinal secretions will be, for example, pancreatic secretions, enzymes being added to the junction between the stomach and small intestine for digestion of certain types of food, for example. Some of the hypothalamic functions specifically include thermoregulation. So we have basically a built-in thermostat, which is seated in the hypothalamus that monitors our body temperature. Hypothalamic nuclei are also going to regulate food and water intake, so regulating feelings of hunger and satiety, responding to hormones influencing hunger, energy expenditure, and long-term control of body mass. There's a thirst center that controls and monitors osmolarity of the blood and can stimulate the production of an antidiuretic hormone, which is a hormone that helps prevent excessive water loss. We have sleep and circadian rhythms, circadian having to do with daily rhythms. These are seated in the suprachiasmatic nucleus that sits above the optic chiasm, again where the optic nerves from the eyeballs cross over as they are making their way to the brain. And then we also have memory functions. The mammillary nuclei receive signals from the hippocampus, which is a major control center for memory, also emotional behavior and sexual response. So the hypothalamic nuclei are again color-coded like we saw with the thalamic nuclei. Anterior nucleus regulates thirst and thermoregulation. Arcuate nucleus regulates appetite, secretes releasing hormones that regulate anterior pituitary, etc. So we have a number of different nuclei that have their own specific functions. So basically this is showing this little section here with the connection to the pituitary gland. So this is anterior and posterior pituitary gland down here. So various views of the hypothalamus. Again, it's not as if you can necessarily make out distinct anatomical boundaries with the thalamus and hypothalamus. It's going to be a regional identification. So hypothalamus, if you have a coronal section, basically this is the extent of the hypothalamus surrounding the third ventricle. And again, hypo means lower or below. So hypothalamus really just means below the thalamus. So the thalamus is up here, the hypothalamus is down here. And then this, you're going to be able to see the infundibulum, which is that stalk for the pituitary gland right here. So the hypothalamus, again, your infundibulum, the stalk to the pituitary gland, and then your pituitary gland itself, seated in this little landmark called the sella tristica. Finally, we have the epithalamus. Epi basically means above, so epithalamus is a very small mass of tissue that's composed of the pineal gland, which is another endocrine gland, and the habenula, which relays signals from the limbic system to the midbrain.